I watched men become monsters. Not through evil, through medicine. They wore black leather beaks filled with rotting flowers, and children screamed when they saw them coming. Let me tell you about the day healing became horror. Welcome, I'm the historian. I have wandered through ages where people believed impossible things for perfectly logical reasons. Tonight, I want to tell you about plague doctors, not the story you know, but the one I lived through. It's different than you might expect. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you find comfort in old stories during sleepless hours. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. Together we turn the lonely hours of night into something softer. Now dim the lights, settle in. What I'm about to share might change how you see things, but I promise to tell it gently. I was there when Giovanni della Morte first put on the mask. Venice, 1348. The year the world ended, though we didn't know it yet. The Black Death had arrived like a rumor that became reality overnight. One day, merchants complained of delayed shipments from the east. The next, bodies floated in the canals like broken dolls. And the city needed heroes. That's what we thought we were getting. Heroes. Giovanni was a learned man. University of Padua. Could read Latin, Greek, even some Arabic texts that had survived the library burnings. When the city council met in the Doge's palace, windows sealed tight against the bad air, they chose him to lead the medical response. We need someone who understands science, they said. Someone who can fight this rationally. Science. God, if they only knew what their science would become. See, in 1348, medicine wasn't guesswork. It was a precise system built on 14 centuries of accumulated wisdom. Galen's teachings, refined by Islamic scholars, perfected by European universities. They had answers for everything. The plague was caused by miasma, poison air created when celestial bodies aligned incorrectly. The cure was logical. Purify the air, balance the humors, remove the corrupted blood. Simple, elegant, completely reasonable. Giovanni accepted his appointment with the solemnity of a priest taking holy orders. Because to him, that's exactly what he was doing. He was going to save humanity using the most advanced medical knowledge in human history. I remember the day he first showed me the costume. We were in his workshop above the apothecary shop on the Rialto. Books everywhere. Astrolabes. Jars of herbs whose names I couldn't pronounce. And there, hanging on a wooden frame like some fever dream, was the outfit that would make him famous. The black leather coat went from neck to ankle, thick enough to stop a sword thrust, waterproofed with wax and oils that made it gleam like beetle shells. Over that, a cape that could wrap around his entire body. Then came the hat, wide-brimmed, imposing, marking him as a man of authority. But the mask, Jesus, the mask, it was beautiful, in the way a funeral is beautiful. Crafted by Venetian artisans who usually made carnival faces for noblemen's parties. Smooth black leather stretched over a wooden frame. Glass eyepieces, perfectly round, that turned the wearer's eyes into dark mirrors. And the beak, 6 inches of leather formed into a perfect bird's beak, hollow inside, with holes at the tip for breathing. Giovanni opened it like a locket to show me the interior. Aromatic herbs, he explained, his voice filled with quiet pride. Crushed roses, thyme, lavender, mint. When the plague air enters through the holes, it passes through God's own pharmacy. The sweet scents will purify whatever corruption tries to reach my lungs. I touched the leather. It was smooth as silk, cold as stone. And if it doesn't work? He laughed. Actually, I laughed. My friend, this knowledge comes from Hippocrates himself, refined by Avicenna, approved by the Church. It cannot fail because it is built on truth itself. That night, I watched him put on the full costume for the first time. It took 20 minutes. Layer by layer, like a knight arming for battle. When he was finished, he stood before his mirror, 7 feet tall including the hat, completely enclosed in black leather, the glass eyes reflecting candlelight like stars. "How do I look?" he asked, and his voice came out muffled, hollow, like someone calling from inside a tomb. "Terrifying," I said honestly. "Good," he replied. "The sick need to know that death itself has come to cure them." He meant it as comfort. The ultimate comfort, that even death cared enough to learn medicine. That was Tuesday. Wednesday, he would make his first house call. By Sunday, I would understand that we had created something infinitely worse than the plague. But Tuesday night, drinking wine in his workshop while he polished the glass eyepieces, we still believed we were witnessing the birth of a medical miracle. The Morosini family lived in a palace that faced the Grand Canal. Old money, older than Venice itself. When little Caterina started coughing blood, they didn't call for a priest. They called for science. I followed Giovanni that Wednesday morning, partly from curiosity, mostly from friendship. The city had changed overnight. Streets that once bustled with merchants now echoed with the sound of our footsteps. Shops were boarded shut. The few people we passed pressed themselves against walls and crossed themselves when they saw Giovanni. Approaching, the effect of the costume was profound. Children stopped crying when they saw him. Just stopped. Pointed with tiny fingers at the black figure gliding through the morning mist, the beak cutting through fog like a ship's prow. Mothers grabbed their little ones and whispered prayers. "They fear me," Giovanni said through the leather beak. "Good. Fear keeps them at a safe distance." But I saw something else in their faces. Not just fear, recognition, like they were looking at something their nightmares had been preparing them for. We arrived at the Morosini Palace as the sun reached noon. The family waited in the courtyard. Father, mother, 3 servants, all maintaining the prescribed distance from the infected. In the center, on a chair that had been dragged from the house, sat 8-year-old Caterina. She was beautiful, even with death on her face. Golden hair that caught the sunlight, eyes blue as summer sky, and across her neck, under her arms, the telltale swellings that meant the plague had marked her for collection. The family expected theater. Medieval medicine was always theater. So Giovanni gave them theater. He approached the child with measured steps, the leather coat creaking with each movement. The glass eyes reflected her face as he bent down to examine her. When he spoke, his voice echoed from inside the beak like words spoken from the bottom of a well. "The corruption has entered through the lungs," he announced. "The miasma has settled in the blood, creating an imbalance of humors that manifests as swollen nodes and bloody expectoration." The father nodded gravely. This was exactly what he'd hoped to hear. Not that his daughter was dying, but that someone understood exactly why she was dying. Giovanni opened his leather bag. Inside were the tools of rational medicine. Glass vials filled with carefully prepared tinctures. Silver instruments polished to mirror brightness. And in the center, wrapped in white cloth like a holy relic, the brass cupping set. "We will begin with bloodletting to remove the corrupted humors," he explained, unwrapping the cupping glasses. "Then purification through aromatic therapy and herbal treatment." I watched him heat the cupping glasses over a small brazier. The process was elegant, scientific. Heat the air inside the glass. Place it on the patient's skin. Let the cooling air create suction that would draw out the bad blood. Caterina whimpered when the hot glass touched her neck, right over the largest swelling. Giovanni's voice came soft and reassuring from inside the beak. "Be brave, little one. We're drawing out the poison that hurts you." The glass is filled with blood. Dark blood, almost black. Giovanni nodded with satisfaction. "You see? The corruption leaves her body. We are winning." He applied 6 more cups. 6 more glass bulbs filled with the child's blood while her face grew paler and her breathing became more labored. But Giovanni was reading from a different book than reality. In his book, pale skin meant the bad humors were leaving. Labored breathing meant the lungs were clearing themselves. "Now the aromatics," he announced, opening the vials. The smell hit us like a physical force. Not pleasant herbs, but something else. Something that made my eyes water and my throat close. Giovanni had mixed his aromatic purifiers with mercury, sulfur, and something he called virtuous arsenic, compounds that would drive the plague from her body through their pure toxicity. He held a cloth soaked in this mixture under Katerina's nose. "Breathe deeply, child. Let the purified air drive out the poisoned air." She tried to pull away, but her father held her shoulders. "Trust the doctor, Katerina. He's here to save you." For 20 minutes, Giovanni made that little girl breathe poison while her family watched with expressions of hope and gratitude. When she started vomiting, he nodded approvingly. "The corruption fights to stay, but it weakens. Tomorrow we will complete the cure." We left the Morosini Palace at sunset. Giovanni was triumphant, already planning the next day's treatment. I was quiet, replaying the scene in my mind, trying to understand why watching a child receive the best medical care available felt like watching a murder in slow motion. "You seem troubled," Giovanni said as we walked through the empty streets. "She looked worse when we left than when we arrived." He stopped walking. The glass eyes turned toward me, reflecting the last rays of sunlight like twin suns. "My friend, you are watching the body's natural resistance to healing. The corruption does not surrender easily. That is why medicine requires courage from the doctor and the patient." That night, lying in my bed above the tavern, I listened to the sounds of Venice dying. Funeral bells that never stopped ringing. Priests chanting last rites in voices hoarse from overuse. And somewhere in the darkness, a child was coughing herself to sleep, while her parents prayed that tomorrow would bring a miracle. I had no way of knowing that tomorrow would indeed bring something miraculous, just not the miracle anyone wanted. By the end of the first week, Giovanni had treated 43 patients using the most advanced medical protocols available to human knowledge. 43 patients died. But here's the thing that kept him working, kept him believing, kept him putting on that leather beak every morning. Every single death confirmed his theories. When patients died quickly after bloodletting, it proved the corruption had been too advanced to cure. When they died slowly, it proved the medicine was working but had been administered too late. When they died peacefully, it proved his aromatics had provided comfort. When they died in agony, it proved the corruption was fighting the cure. Every outcome was evidence that he was right. I started following him regularly, partly from fascination, partly from mounting horror. Each house call was a masterclass in logical medicine producing illogical results. And with each patient, Giovanni's confidence grew. The Torriani merchant family. The father had developed telltale fever and swelling. Giovanni's prescribed treatment, mercury dissolved in wine, to be drunk while sitting in a bath heated to near boiling temperature. The theory was elegant. Mercury would poison the plague while the heat would open the patient's pores, allowing the toxins to escape through the skin. I watched Marco Torriani drink liquid mercury while sitting in water so hot it raised blisters on his legs. His family stood around the tub, holding incense burners filled with Giovanni's aromatic mixtures, creating a fog of toxic herbs that made everyone in the room dizzy. "You see how he sweats?" Giovanni pointed to the dying man's face. "The poison leaves his body through every pore. By tomorrow, he will be purified." Marco Torriani was dead by midnight. Cause of death: mercury poisoning complicated by severe burns and respiratory failure from inhaling toxic herbs. Official cause of death: Recorded in Giovanni's medical notes, succumbed to advanced plague corruption despite aggressive purification therapy. The widow thanked Giovanni through her tears, paid him in gold, begged him to treat her daughter, who had started coughing that morning. That's when I realized we were witnessing something more terrifying than incompetent medicine. We were watching competent medicine. Medicine practiced exactly as it was supposed to be practiced, produce results indistinguishable from systematic murder and everyone involved, from the doctor to the families to the city officials, interpreted these murders as proof that the system was working. The daughter, little Maria Toriani, received the full treatment protocol, bloodletting to remove corrupted humors, aromatic purification using concentrated herbs mixed with arsenic compounds, mercury wine administered while she sat in scalding baths. And when these treatments made her violently ill, Giovanni added a new innovation: trepanation. The corruption has reached her brain, he explained to the family, unpacking a leather case filled with surgical instruments. We must release the poisoned air directly. I will spare you the details of what it looks like when a learned doctor drills a hole in a child's skull using 14th century surgical techniques. But I will tell you this: Maria Toriani died with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, while her mother held her hand and thanked God for sending such a skilled physician. Giovanni recorded this as another victory against plague corruption, noting that the patient had achieved a peaceful death, proving his treatments had provided comfort in her final hours. By the third week, something even stranger began happening. Giovanni's reputation was growing. Word spread through Venice that the city had found a doctor who understood the plague's true nature. Families started requesting him specifically, not because his patients recovered. Everyone knew plague patients died, but because they died scientifically, with dignity, with the comfort of knowing that everything possible had been done. The church endorsed his methods. The university sent students to observe his techniques. The Doge himself wrote a letter praising Giovanni's dedication to rational medicine during the crisis. And the people loved him, genuinely loved him. Because here's what I learned during those terrible weeks. When people are facing something completely beyond their control, they don't want someone who admits ignorance. They want someone who provides certainty, even if that certainty is deadly. Giovanni provided certainty. Every symptom meant something. Every treatment addressed a specific cause. Every death served a larger purpose in the battle between scientific medicine and chaotic disease. The fact that his scientific medicine killed every single patient faster than the disease would have. Killed them naturally became irrelevant. What mattered was that the deaths meant something. I started keeping my own records. Not medical notes, but human observations. The Rossi family. 4 members died of plague over 3 weeks. The Bianchi family. 4 members treated by Giovanni. All dead within 5 days. Natural plague progression. 2 to 6 weeks of illness before death. Plague doctor treatment. 3 to 7 days from first treatment to death. Giovanni's medicine was performing miracles. It was making death merciful by making it swift. But something was building in the city. Something I noticed in the faces of the survivors. In the whispered conversations in empty piazzas. In the way people looked at that black leather figure, gliding through morning mist. They were starting to see patterns too, and their patterns were different from Giovanni's patterns. That's when I realized the real story wasn't about plague doctors failing to cure the plague. The real story was about what happened when people started to understand what their plague doctors were actually doing. It started with Isabella Cani, the baker's daughter. She lived on a narrow street behind the Rialto market, in a house that smelled permanently of flour and yeast. When she developed the fever and swelling, her father sent for Giovanni immediately. Not because he believed in cure. No one believed in cure. anymore, but because Giovanni had become the city's official manager of dying. I arrived as Giovanni was setting up his equipment in the family's main room. The familiar ritual: leather bag opened on the kitchen table, instruments arranged in precise rows, aromatic herbs already burning in clay bowls. Isabella sat on a wooden chair in the center of the room, 19 years old, golden hair braided down her back, watching the black-beaked figure with the quiet resignation of someone who knew exactly how her story would end. But something was different this time. "Doctor," her father said quietly, "before you begin, may I ask you something?" Giovanni's glass eyes turned toward him. "Of course. My neighbor, Carlo the fishmonger. You treated his whole family last month." "Yes." The corruption had spread through their household. "We fought valiantly, but they all died within 3 days. The plague had advanced too far before I arrived." The baker nodded slowly. "And the Benedetti family, 2 streets over. You treated them the week before. A tragic case. The miasma had penetrated deeply into their humoral balance. All dead within 4 days." Giovanni was silent for a moment, the leather beak turning slightly as he processed this line of questioning. When he spoke, his voice carried the patient tone of a teacher explaining basic concepts to a slow student. "My friend, you must understand. I am called to the most desperate cases. Families only send for a plague doctor when death is already certain. My role is not to prevent death, but to ensure it comes with dignity and understanding." The baker's hands trembled as he counted coins from a small leather pouch. "It's just, my wife's sister lives in Padua. The plague reached them 2 months ago. No doctors available, everyone fleeing the city. Tragic. Without medical intervention, the suffering must have been terrible. Actually, she says it was. Strange. People got sick, most died, but it took weeks, sometimes months. Her neighbor fought the fever for 6 weeks before finally passing. My wife's cousin recovered completely after a month of illness." I watched Giovanni's posture shift almost imperceptibly. The black leather coat seemed to tighten around his shoulders. "Impossible," he said flatly. "Without proper medical care, plague victims die within days from the corrupted humors. What you describe suggests misdiagnosis, but she sent letters. Describe the symptoms exactly. The swellings, the fever, the blood. Then the people of Padua are fortunate that their plague was less virulent than ours here in Venice." Giovanni's voice carried a note of finality. "Now, if we may proceed, your daughter's condition grows more serious with each moment of delay." The baker stepped back, but I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not suspicion exactly, just noticing. Giovanni began the treatment protocol. Bloodletting first, 6 cupping glasses applied to Isabella's neck and arms while she grew progressively paler. Then the aromatics, toxic herb mixtures that made her eyes stream and her breathing labored. Finally, the mercury wine, administered while she sat in a scalding bath. Isabella Conti died that night, exactly as predicted. Her family thanked Giovanni through their tears, paid him in bread and silver, and spent the next day preparing for a funeral. But the baker's questions echoed in my mind as I walked home through empty streets. And for the first time in 2 months, I found myself asking a different question. What would happen if a plague doctor never came at all? I never intended to become a secret observer of untreated plague cases. It started by accident, when I knocked on the wrong door looking for Giovanni's next appointment. The Alberti family lived in a tiny house near Arsenal. When I knocked, an old woman answered with eyes red from weeping. "Are you here about Francesco?" she asked. I almost corrected her, but something made me hesitate. "How is he?" She led me inside to a small bedroom where a young man lay on a straw mattress, burning with fever. The telltale swellings bulged under his jaw and arms. His breathing was rapid and shallow. "It started 4 days ago," my grandmother whispered. "We sent for the plague doctor twice, but he never came. I think perhaps God wants us to face this alone. I should have left immediately. Should have told her to keep sending for Giovanni. Instead, I heard myself asking, how are you caring for him? Water when he can drink it. Cool clothes for the fever. I sing to him when the pain gets bad." She touched his forehead with weathered fingers. "My grandmother survived the great mortality when I was a child. She always said the body knows how to fight if you don't interfere too much." I stayed for an hour, telling myself I was gathering information for Giovanni. But really, I was watching something I'd never seen before. A plague victim receiving no medical treatment whatsoever. Francesco Alberti looked terrible. The fever had burned all the fat from his face, leaving sharp cheekbones and hollow eyes. The swellings were enormous, grotesque. But he was conscious, sipping water when his grandmother held a cup to his lips, even managing a weak smile when she sang old songs from her childhood. I returned 3 days later. Francesco was still alive? This should have been impossible. According to everything Giovanni had taught me, according to 14 centuries of accumulated medical wisdom, a plague victim left untreated would die within days from corrupted humors running wild through the bloodstream. But Francesco Alberti was not only alive, he was talking, asking for food, complaining about being bedridden. "The swellings are smaller," his grandmother told me, her voice filled with wondering hope. "And the fever broke last night." He slept peacefully for the first time in a week. I examined him myself, using the diagnostic techniques I'd watched Giovanni employ. The buboes under his arms were definitely smaller, softer to the touch. His breathing was clear. His skin, though still pale, had lost the grayish tint that preceded death. Francesco Alberti was recovering from the plague. This was medically impossible, but happening in front of my eyes. I started visiting other families, using the excuse of searching for Giovanni's next appointment. What I found shattered every assumption I'd built about plague and medicine and the nature of disease itself. The Rossetti family, grandmother, 2 parents, 3 children, all developed plague symptoms within days of each other. No money for a plague doctor. I found them 2 weeks after the onset, gathered around their kitchen table eating watery soup. All alive, all recovering. The Marcello household, father and son both infected, both treated with nothing but rest, water, and prayers. The father died after 3 weeks of illness. The son recovered completely and was back to work as a carpenter. The Fabri family, mother and 2 daughters, no medical intervention. All 3 survivors after a month of illness. I was documenting something that contradicted everything I thought I understood about plague and medicine. Left untreated, plague patients died at roughly the same rate as treated patients, about 60% mortality. But the untreated patients died after weeks of illness, not days, and 40% of them recovered completely. Meanwhile, Giovanni's treated patients died in less than a week. 100% mortality. I started keeping careful records, hidden in a locked chest in my room. Patient names, symptoms, treatments received, outcomes. The pattern was consistent and terrifying. Plague plus no treatment equals weeks of illness. 40% recovery rate, plague plus plague doctor treatment equals days until death. 0% recovery rate. Giovanni's medicine wasn't failing to cure the plague. Giovanni's medicine was preventing recovery from the plague. But this led to an even more disturbing realization. If I could see this pattern, why couldn't Giovanni? I decided to confront Giovanni with my observations, not as an accusation, but as a puzzle we could solve together. After all, we were both seeking truth, both trying to understand what was happening to our city. I found him in his workshop on a gray October morning. cleaning his instruments after another night house call. The familiar leather costume hung on its wooden frame like an empty shell. Without the mask, Giovanni looked human again, tired, worried, older than his 43 years. "My friend," I said carefully, "I've been thinking about mortality rates." He looked up from polishing a cupping glass. A grim but necessary subject. "What troubles you?" "I've noticed that your patients tend to die very quickly compared to what I'd expect from plague progression." Giovanni nodded gravely. "The corruption works swiftly here in Venice. The miasma from the canals, perhaps, or the density of population. We are seeing a particularly virulent strain, but I've heard reports from other parts of the city, families where the plague doctors couldn't respond in time. Those cases seem to progress more slowly." I watched his face carefully as I said this. There was no change in expression, no flicker of doubt or recognition. Just the patient attention of a teacher waiting for a student to reach the obvious conclusion. "Naturally," Giovanni said, "without proper medical intervention, the corruption spreads unchecked through the humoral system. The patient experiences prolonged suffering as the bad humors gradually overwhelm the good ones. It's a mercy that my treatments accelerate the process. But what if some of those untreated patients recover?" Giovanni set down his polishing cloth and looked at me with genuine concern. "My friend, that's impossible. Recovery from plague requires the removal of corrupted humors through bloodletting and the purification of remaining humors through aromatic therapy. Without these interventions, corruption inevitably proves fatal. But hypothetically, there is no hypothesis here," Giovanni interrupted, his voice growing firm. "What you're suggesting contradicts Galen, Avicenna, and 15 centuries of accumulated medical knowledge. It would be like suggesting that fire doesn't burn or that water doesn't flow downhill." I tried a different approach. "Have you ever personally observed an untreated plague case from start to finish?" Giovanni considered this. "No, but then, what physician would allow a patient to suffer without treatment? It would violate every oath we take. So your understanding of untreated plague comes from texts, not observation, from the greatest medical minds in history, yes. Knowledge tested and refined by countless generations of physicians." I took a breath and decided to risk everything. "Giovanni, what if those physicians were wrong?" The silence that followed was longer and more dangerous than I'd expected. Giovanni stood slowly, walked to his bookshelf, and pulled down a heavy volume bound in leather and brass. When he opened it, I saw pages covered in dense Latin text, elaborate diagrams of the human body, charts showing the relationship between planetary movements and humoral balance. "This," he said quietly, "is the canon of medicine by Avicenna. Do you see the complexity of the diagrams? The precision of the measurements? The logical connections between observable symptoms and underlying causes?" I nodded. This knowledge wasn't guessed at or wished into existence. It was built observation by observation, case by case, over centuries of careful study. When I treat a patient, I'm not improvising. I'm applying knowledge that has saved countless lives across the Islamic world, the Byzantine Empire, and Christian Europe. He turned pages, showing me increasingly elaborate medical diagrams. Every symptom has a cause. Every cause has a treatment. Every treatment follows logically from established principles. To suggest that this entire system is wrong would mean that the greatest minds in human history were all deceived by the same impossible error. But if the results contradict the theory, then the observer is making errors, not the theory. Giovanni closed the book with a decisive thump. "My friend, I understand the emotional difficulty of watching patients die, but we cannot let grief cloud our judgment. The medicine works because it is based on truth. The patients die because that is what plague does. Our role is to ensure their deaths serve the larger purpose of advancing medical knowledge. I left his workshop that morning understanding something that chilled me more than any plague symptom. Giovanni wasn't ignoring the evidence that his treatments killed people. He was interpreting the deaths as proof that his treatments worked. Word of the plague doctor's success spread beyond Venice through trade routes and diplomatic correspondence. By November, cities across northern Italy were requesting their own plague doctors. The University of Padua established a formal training program. The church issued guidelines for incorporating plague doctor protocols into last rites procedures, and I watched the horror multiply. Each new plague doctor received the same training Giovanni had, the same medical texts, the same treatment protocols, the same rational understanding of disease causation. Each began their practice with the same absolute confidence in scientific medicine. Marco di Firenze arrived in Venice in late November to study Giovanni's techniques before establishing his practice in Florence. I watched him attend his first patient examination, taking careful notes while Giovanni demonstrated proper bloodletting procedures on a merchant's wife. The key, Giovanni explained as he applied heated cupping glasses to the woman's neck, is aggressive intervention before the corruption can establish itself. Hesitation is cruelty, Marco nodded eagerly. Master, in Florence we've heard that some physicians try to treat plague with rest and nutrition. What is your opinion of such approaches? Giovanni's laugh echoed strangely through his leather beak. Such physicians understand neither the nature of disease nor the principles of cure. Plague is not weakness to be fed, but corruption to be expelled. The patient needs purification, not comfort. The merchant's wife died that evening, exactly on schedule. Marco recorded this as a successful demonstration of proper technique, noting how quickly the patient had achieved peaceful death within a month. Marco was practicing in Florence, producing the same miraculous results Giovanni had achieved in Venice. Every patient died swiftly, scientifically, with the comfort of knowing they had received the best care available. Letters arrived from grateful city officials praising Marco's dedication. The University of Florence invited him to lecture on advanced plague treatment. Families fought for the privilege of having their loved ones treated by such a skilled physician, and in his letters to Giovanni, Marco expressed puzzlement at reports from rural areas where no plague doctors were available. The strangest thing, he wrote, I've heard rumors of plague victims in mountain villages surviving their illness for weeks or even months before succumbing. Some supposedly recover completely. Obviously, these are cases of misdiagnosis, but the persistence of such stories suggests a dangerous level of medical ignorance among the peasantry. Giovanni shared this letter with me, shaking his head at the tragic implications. The poor die in ignorance, he said sadly. They suffer needlessly because they lack access to scientific medicine. If we could train more plague doctors, establish more hospitals, we could bring merciful death to everyone who needs it, I realized with growing horror that what I was witnessing wasn't medical failure, it was a medical success. The system was working exactly as designed. Plague doctors were fulfilling their function perfectly, providing certainty in chaos, meaning in suffering, and swift death disguised as attempted cure. And the more successful they became, the more the practice spread. By December, the plague doctor system had achieved something unprecedented in medieval medicine: standardization. Every major city in northern Italy now had trained plague doctors following identical protocols. The University of Bologna created the first formal certification program. The Pope issued a papal bull declaring plague doctor methods to be in accordance with both natural philosophy and Christian doctrine. Medical students traveled hundreds of miles to observe the techniques. Master physicians abandoned their private practices to focus exclusively on plague treatment. The black leather costumes became symbols of hope and scientific progress, and everywhere the system spread, the same miraculous results followed: swift, dignified death for every patient treated. I started receiving reports from friends in other cities, merchants who traveled the trade routes, priests who corresponded with colleagues across the region. The stories were identical. Genoa, plague doctor Tommaso di Liguria treats 47 patients, all dead within a week. City officials praise his compassionate efficiency. Milan, plague doctor Alessandro di Milano establishes treatment protocols for the entire city. Natural plague mortality drops to zero as every case receives immediate medical attention. Total mortality increases by 300%. Bologna, plague doctor Francesco di Emilia develops improved aromatic mixtures using concentrated arsenic and mercury compounds. Patient death time reduced to an average of 3 days. University awards him honorary doctorate in natural philosophy. The pattern was spreading like the plague itself, but faster. Because unlike disease, medical knowledge traveled at the speed of human ambition. Every success story encouraged more cities to request their own plague doctors. Every rapid death was interpreted as evidence of superior medical care. Every grateful family payment funded the training of additional physicians. I was watching the birth of the first systematic, coordinated, continent-wide medical disaster in human history, and the most terrifying part wasn't that it was happening. Most terrifying part was that everyone involved, from the physicians to the patients, to the city officials to the church hierarchy, interpreted this disaster as miraculous progress. In the fight against disease, the first crack in the system's perfect logic came from an unexpected source. The gravediggers. Pietro was a gravedigger at San Michele Cemetery, a man who had spent 30 years burying Venice's dead. He knew death intimately, how bodies decomposed, how diseases progressed, how families grieved. And after 6 months of burying plague doctor patients, he started asking uncomfortable questions. "It's strange," he told me one evening in December, both of us sharing wine outside his cottage near the cemetery gates. "I've buried plague victims for decades. Usually, they waste away slowly. The disease takes time to consume them. But these new cases," he gestured toward the cemetery, where fresh graves stretched in neat rows like a farmer's field. "They're different. The bodies are wrong." "Wrong how?" Pietro refilled his cup, thinking carefully about his words. "When someone dies of plague naturally, the body tells a story. You can see how the disease progressed, what it did over weeks or months. But the plague doctor cases, they look like they died of something else entirely, such as poison," he said quietly. "They look like they've been poisoned." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "That's impossible. The plague doctors use established medical procedures." Pietro nodded slowly. "I know. That's what makes it strange. Because I've also buried people who died of mercury poisoning, alchemists who made mistakes, miners who worked the cinnabar deposits. The plague doctor patients look exactly like mercury poisoning victims. Same skin color, same organ damage, same." He paused, searching for words. "Same expression of surprise, like they died confused about what was happening to them." This conversation haunted me for days. I started paying closer attention to the bodies at Giovanni's treatments, watching not just for symptoms of plague, but for signs of what was actually killing his patients. The evidence was everywhere. Once I knew how to look, the grayish pallor that Giovanni interpreted as corrupted humors leaving the body was actually the skin tone of acute mercury poisoning. The violent vomiting that he saw as the corruption fighting the cure was arsenic toxicity. The rapid breathing that he called lungs purifying themselves was respiratory failure from inhaling concentrated toxic herbs. Giovanni wasn't treating plague symptoms. He was creating entirely new symptoms that were killing people faster than the plague ever could. But here's what made my blood run cold. The system was so logically constructed that this distinction was invisible to anyone operating within it. Every mercury poisoning death was recorded as a plague death. Every arsenic toxicity death was cataloged as plague mortality. Every treatment-induced fatality became evidence that the plague was especially virulent. The medical records were perfect. The logic was flawless. The system was completely self-confirming, and it was spreading faster than any disease in human history. By January, I had compiled enough secret observations to understand the true scope of what was happening. My hidden records showed untreated plague cases, 40% survival rate. Average illness duration 4 to 6 weeks. Plague doctor-treated cases, 0% survival rate. Average death time 3 to 7 days. Cause of death in treated cases, mercury poisoning, 60%. Arsenic toxicity, 25%. Exsanguination from excessive bloodletting, 10%. Respiratory failure from toxic aromatics, 5%. But I also discovered something that made me understand why the system was spreading so successfully despite these horrific results. The plague doctors weren't lying. They genuinely believed their treatments worked because they had created a closed logical system that interpreted every outcome as confirmation of their theories. Does the patient die quickly? The treatment provided merciful relief. Does the patient die slowly? The corruption was too advanced, but the treatment prevented suffering. Does the patient show signs of mercury poisoning? Those are symptoms of corrupted humors being expelled from the body. Every single death proved the doctors were right, and the more patients died, the more grateful the families became. Because swift death was preferable to prolonged suffering, the plague doctors had accidentally discovered that systematic poisoning could be disguised as compassionate medicine. Provided you had the right theoretical framework to interpret the results, this wasn't malice. This was medical science functioning exactly as it was designed to function, producing results that contradicted reality while maintaining perfect internal consistency. I realized I was documenting the birth of something unprecedented, the first evidence-based medical atrocity in human history. February brought news that made my documentation feel suddenly urgent. The plague doctor system was no longer confined to Italian cities. Reports arrived of trained physicians establishing practices in France, the German states, even as far as England. The University of Paris had established a plague doctor training college. The Holy Roman Emperor had issued edicts requiring all plague cases to receive immediate medical attention from certified physicians. The English crown was recruiting Italian plague doctors to establish practices in London. Each new city received the same training materials, the same treatment protocols, the same assurance that they were implementing the most advanced medical knowledge available. Each began producing the same miraculous results: swift, scientific death for every plague victim. But the most disturbing development came in a letter from my friend Antonio. Now working as a scribe in the papal administration, His Holiness has been deeply impressed by the success of plague doctor treatments, Antonio wrote. He is considering a papal decree making plague doctor consultation mandatory for all Christians suffering from pestilence. The Church sees this as both a medical and spiritual victory, bringing the comfort of scientific understanding to the dying while ensuring proper last rites. Procedures. I read this letter 3 times before the full implications sank in. The Church was about to make treatment by plague doctors a religious obligation. This would transform what was currently a medical disaster affecting major cities into a continent-wide catastrophe affecting every Christian community in Europe. Millions of people who might survive plague naturally would be legally required to receive treatments that would kill them within days. The system wasn't just spreading anymore, it was about to become mandatory. March brought the worst news yet. Giovanni received an official appointment as chief plague doctor for the Venetian Republic, with authority to establish training protocols for the entire Mediterranean region. My friend told me excitedly, "We have achieved something unprecedented. For the first time in history, we can bring scientific medicine to every plague victim in Europe. No one will have to suffer in ignorance anymore." He showed me the commission documents, signed by the Doge himself and endorsed by representatives from a dozen Italian cities. Giovanni was now responsible for training plague doctors across the known world. Within 6 months, he projected, every major population center from Constantinople to London would have certified plague doctors providing scientific care to disease victims. "Imagine," Giovanni said, his eyes bright with missionary fervor, "an end to needless suffering, death with dignity and understanding. The triumph of human knowledge over chaos and superstition." I calculated the numbers while he spoke. If every plague case in Europe received plague doctor treatment, and if the treatment maintained its current 100% mortality rate, we would be looking at the systematic medical murder of millions of people who would otherwise have had a 40% chance of recovery. Giovanni's medical miracle was about to become the largest mass killing in human history, and he was planning it with the sincere desire to reduce human suffering. That night, I made a decision that changed everything. I decided to stop being a passive observer and become an active saboteur, not of medicine itself, but of the logical system that had made medical murder indistinguishable from medical care. I started small, with individual families who couldn't afford plague doctor services. When the Valdrome family developed plague symptoms, I told them Giovanni was unavailable, but suggested they try a new treatment I'd learned from Eastern traders: rest, water, light broths, and prayer. Nothing else. Especially no bloodletting, no aromatics, no mercury compounds. "But surely some medicine is better than none?" the father asked anxiously. "Sometimes," I said carefully, "the body heals better without interference." It felt like heresy to even speak these words. 15 centuries of medical wisdom said that disease required active intervention. But I watched the Valdrome family care for their sick members using nothing but common sense and basic comfort measures. 3 weeks later, 4 out of 5 family members had recovered completely. I tried the same approach with the Castellani family, the Grimaldi family, the Morettis. Each time, I presented experimental Eastern treatment as an alternative to unavailable plague doctor services. The results were consistent: 40% mortality, 60% recovery rate. Exactly what my secret observations had predicted for untreated plague cases. But I realized this small-scale sabotage was meaningless against the larger pattern. For every family I secretly treated with no treatment, Giovanni was training dozens of new plague doctors who would systematically poison thousands of patients. I needed to find a way to expose the logical flaw at the heart of the entire system, and I needed to do it in a way that wouldn't get me burned as a heretic for contradicting 14 centuries of accumulated medical wisdom. The breakthrough came when I realized that the plague doctor system contained the seeds of its own destruction, hidden in its perfect logical consistency. Giovanni's treatments worked because every outcome confirmed his theories. But this created a vulnerability. If I could introduce a logical inconsistency that couldn't be explained away, the entire theoretical framework might collapse. I needed a test case that would force Giovanni to confront evidence that contradicted his worldview in a way that couldn't be reinterpreted as supporting evidence. The Opportunity came in April, when the wealthy Venetian merchant Lorenzo di Marco requested Giovanni's services for his entire household. 12 people showing early plague symptoms. Master, I said to Giovanni as he prepared his equipment, I have a suggestion that might improve your treatment outcomes. He looked up with interest. Yes, what if we divided the household into 2 groups? Treat half with your full protocol, but delay treatment for the other half by 1 week. This would allow us to observe how the corruption progresses without intervention, providing better baseline data for measuring treatment effectiveness. Giovanni considered this. From his perspective, it made perfect sense. Delaying treatment for half the patients would demonstrate how much worse their outcomes were compared to the immediately treated group. Brilliant, he said finally. This will provide clear evidence of treatment efficacy. The delayed group will suffer prolonged agony, while the immediate treatment group achieves swift, merciful death. He divided the Lorenzo di Marco household randomly. 6 people received immediate plague doctor treatment. 6 received only basic care until treatment could be provided a week later. I watched Giovanni treat the first group with his full protocol: bloodletting, aromatic purification, mercury wine, scalding baths. Within 3 days, all 6 were dead. You see, Giovanni told the grieving family. Immediate intervention provided merciful release from suffering. Then we waited a week to treat the second group. During that week, I watched something that contradicted everything Giovanni believed about plague progression. The 6 untreated patients didn't descend into agony and chaos. Instead, they followed the natural course of plague infection: high fever for several days, gradual reduction in symptoms, slow recovery of strength. By the time their treatment was scheduled to begin, 4 of the 6 were clearly recovering. Their fevers had broken, their swellings were reducing. They were asking for food and complaining about being bedridden. Giovanni stared at these recovering patients in complete bewilderment. According to his medical understanding, this was impossible. Plague victims without treatment should be dead or dying after a week. Instead, he was looking at people who were obviously getting better. This cannot be a plague, he finally announced. These patients were misdiagnosed. But Master, I said carefully, they showed identical symptoms to the first group. Same fever patterns, same swellings, same progression. Giovanni examined the recovering patients himself, using all his diagnostic techniques. The evidence was undeniable. These people had definitely suffered from plague and were definitely recovering without treatment. For the first time in his career, Giovanni encountered evidence that couldn't be explained by his theoretical framework, and I watched his mind try to process this impossibility. Giovanni spent 3 days studying the recovering patients, cross-referencing their symptoms against every medical text in his library, consulting with other learned physicians, even writing to the University of Padua for expert opinions. Every authority confirmed that what he was observing was impossible according to established medical knowledge. Plague victims could not recover without treatment. The corrupted humors could not rebalance themselves naturally. The miasmic poisoning could not be expelled without medical intervention. Yet, for people were doing exactly that in front of his eyes. I watched Giovanni's worldview begin to fracture as he tried to reconcile theoretical certainty with observed reality. Perhaps, he suggested desperately, these patients received some form of inadvertent treatment, something in their diet, their environment, their spiritual practices that functioned as accidental medicine. But his investigation revealed nothing unusual. The recovering patients had received only water, light food, rest, and basic comfort care. Then perhaps the corruption was expelled through some natural crisis we didn't observe. A purging, a fever episode, some form of spontaneous bloodletting. But again, there was no evidence of any such crisis. The patients had simply gradually gotten better. Giovanni's perfect logical system was encountering its first contradiction, and his mind was desperately trying to preserve theoretical consistency by inventing explanations that became increasingly absurd. "Master," I said gently, "what if the recovery is exactly what it appears to be? What if people can sometimes heal from plague naturally?" The silence that followed was the longest and most dangerous of our friendship. When Giovanni finally spoke, his voice was hollow, distant, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well. "If that were true," he said slowly, "then everything I have done, everything I have taught, everyone I have treated," he couldn't finish the sentence, because if plague could be survived naturally, then his treatments hadn't been providing merciful death to the incurably ill. His treatments had been preventing recovery in people who might have lived. Giovanni had spent 8 months systematically murdering patients who came to him for help, and the realization was destroying his mind. Word of Giovanni's experimental treatment delay reached other plague doctors within days. Instead of causing them to question their own methods, it triggered a defensive reaction that revealed the true power of the system they had created. Master physicians from across northern Italy wrote urgent letters condemning Giovanni's dangerous deviation from established protocols. The University of Padua launched an investigation into his unethical experimentation. The church expressed concern about abandoning proven treatments in favor of untested theories. The medical establishment had closed ranks to protect itself from evidence that contradicted its fundamental assumptions. But the most revealing response came from Giovanni's own students, the plague doctors he had trained who were now practicing across Europe. Marco di Firenze wrote, "Master, I have heard disturbing rumors about delayed treatment experiments. Surely you understand that allowing patients to suffer without intervention contradicts every principle of medical ethics. Natural plague progression is inevitably fatal and invariably agonizing. Our duty is to provide merciful release through scientific treatment." Alessandro di Milano. The reports from Venice suggest dangerous thinking that could undermine confidence in plague doctor methods. We must remember that our treatments work precisely because they are based on centuries of accumulated knowledge. Doubt leads to suffering. Francesco di Bologna. Master, I fear you have been deceived by apparent recovery in misdiagnosed patients. True plague cannot be survived without medical intervention. What you observed was certainly some lesser corruption that resembled plague symptoms. Every plague doctor Giovanni had trained rejected the evidence rather than questioned the system that gave their lives meaning, and I realized something that made my blood run cold. The system had become self-preserving. It now had too many people invested in its continued success to allow contradictory evidence to threaten its existence. Giovanni's logical breakthrough was being treated as a psychological breakdown by the very community he had helped create. Within 2 weeks of Giovanni's experimental results, the University of Padua issued a formal statement on proper plague treatment protocols. The document was a masterpiece of institutional self-defense disguised as scientific clarification. Recent reports of apparent plague recovery without medical intervention represent a dangerous misunderstanding of disease progression. The statement read, "What inexperienced observers interpret as natural recovery is actually the slow death process that occurs when corrupted humors are allowed to run their natural course without purification. Such patients may appear to improve temporarily as the corruption spreads throughout their humoral system. But this apparent improvement invariably leads to more agonizing death than would result from proper medical intervention. Furthermore, Allowing plague patients to remain untreated poses grave danger to the community, as the unchecked corruption can spread to others through miasmic contamination. All certified plague doctors are hereby reminded that deviation from established treatment protocols constitutes abandonment of medical duty and may result in suspension of certification. The statement was copied and distributed to every plague doctor in Europe. It provided a perfect theoretical framework for dismissing Giovanni's observations without examining them. Any patient who appeared to recover without treatment was, by definition, either misdiagnosed or temporarily improved before inevitable death. Any physician who questioned treatment protocols was, by definition, abandoning medical ethics. The system had made itself unfalsifiable, but the institutional response revealed something even more disturbing. The medical establishment now depended on plague doctor treatments for its economic survival. Training programs, certification fees, treatment payments, research funding, entire university departments existed solely to support the plague doctor system. Admitting that the treatments were lethal would bankrupt the medical establishment and destroy the careers of hundreds of physicians. The system couldn't allow itself to be wrong, because being wrong would mean institutional suicide. So it simply declared that contradictory evidence was impossible by definition. By May, the plague doctor system had achieved something unprecedented in medieval Europe: complete institutional capture of disease treatment. The papal decree Antonio had warned me about was officially promulgated, making plague doctor consultation mandatory for all Christians suffering from pestilence. Failure to seek proper medical treatment was declared a sin against both God and community. Secular authorities followed suit. The Holy Roman Emperor issued edicts requiring plague doctor certification for all physicians treating disease. The French crown established a royal monopoly on plague treatment, with unauthorized medical practice punishable by death. The English Parliament passed legislation making it illegal for plague victims to refuse medical treatment, on the grounds that untreated disease posed a public health threat. Within 6 months, receiving treatment that was guaranteed to kill you had become a legal and religious obligation across most of Europe. But the most chilling development was the systematic suppression of alternative approaches. Any physician who suggested that plague might be survivable naturally was accused of promoting dangerous superstition. Any family that attempted to care for plague victims without medical intervention was charged with endangering public health. The system had made survival illegal, and the most successful medical establishment in history was now completely committed to preventing people from recovering from disease. I realized I was watching the birth of something that would echo through centuries: the first institutional medical system that existed primarily to perpetuate itself rather than heal patients. The plague doctors had created a machine for converting human suffering into institutional power, and it was spreading faster than any plague in human history. September 1349. Venice was dying, not from plague. The actual disease had largely run its course over the summer, leaving behind the usual pattern of death and recovery, but from the systematic application of scientific medicine to every case of illness in the city. Giovanni hadn't left his house in 3 weeks. I found him sitting in his workshop, staring at the black leather costume hanging on its wooden frame. The books lay scattered across his table: Galen, Avicenna, Hippocrates, open to pages covered in notes and calculations. "I've been reviewing the mortality records," he said without looking up. "Every case I treated, every protocol I followed, every family thanked me for providing merciful death to their loved ones." His voice was hollow, broken, like a man speaking from inside a tomb. "Do you know what I discovered?" I waited, In 8 months of practice, treating over 200 patients with the most advanced medical knowledge available to humanity, I achieved a perfect mortality rate. Not a single recovery, not one miraculous cure, not even an unexpected survival. He finally looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Recognition. "That's not medicine," he said quietly. "That's systematic murder dressed up as science." I sat down across from him, choosing my words carefully. "What will you do now?" Giovanni gestured toward a pile of letters on his table. "These are appointment requests. Families begging me to treat their sick relatives. Students asking for advanced training. City officials requesting expanded services." He picked up one letter, read a few lines. "This is from the widow Benedetti. Her daughter has developed a fever. She's asking me to provide the same merciful treatment I gave her husband last month." Giovanni set the letter down with hands that shook slightly. "Her husband died in agony from mercury poisoning while she held his hand, and thank God for sending such a skilled physician. And now she wants me to do the same thing to her daughter." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. "The system is perfect," Giovanni continued. "Every death proves the medicine works. Every failure becomes evidence of success. Every family that loses someone becomes more grateful for the expert care they received." He stood up and walked to the leather costume, touching the smooth black surface of the beak. "Do you know what the truly horrifying part is? I could continue practicing exactly as I have been, killing every patient I treat, and my reputation would continue to grow. The gratitude would continue. The institutional support would continue. The system would call me a hero until the day I died." Giovanni turned back to me, and I saw something in his expression that made me afraid. "But I've seen the truth now, and I cannot know what I know." Giovanni's breakdown triggered something I hadn't expected, a crisis of conscience among some of his former students. Marco di Firenze was the first to arrive in Venice, concerned about reports of his master's mental distress. I watched their reunion in Giovanni's workshop, two men staring at each other across an unbridgeable gap of understanding. Master Marco said carefully, "I've heard troubling rumors about experimental treatments and questions about established protocols." Giovanni gestured toward his mortality records, spread across the table like accusations. "Look at the numbers, Marco. Really look at them." Marco glanced at the papers with obvious discomfort. "Master, mortality rates are not the measure of medical success. Comfort in dying is the measure. Dignity in death. The prevention of needless suffering. But what if the suffering wasn't needless?" Giovanni asked quietly. "What if it was the body's natural healing process, which we interrupted with poison?" I watched Marco's face cycle through confusion, denial, and mounting panic as Giovanni explained the experimental results. The recovery rates among untreated patients. The mathematical impossibility of 100% treatment mortality if the treatments were actually helping anyone. "Master, you're ill," Marco said finally. "The strain of treating so many patients has affected your judgment. These doubts are symptoms of emotional exhaustion, not medical insight." But Giovanni pressed on, showing Marco the detailed records, the symptom progressions, the clear evidence that plague doctor treatments produced death patterns indistinguishable from systematic poisoning. "Look at this," Giovanni said, opening a medical journal to pages covered in his careful handwriting. Patient after patient, same treatment protocol, same rapid deterioration, same grateful families. Never once did I ask why grateful families were a universal feature of uniformly fatal treatments. Marco stared at the records, his face growing pale. I could see the moment when the evidence became undeniable, when the logical structure that had supported his entire medical career began to collapse. "If this is true," Marco whispered, "then everyone I've treated in Florence, Yes, Giovanni said gently. Everyone. Marco sat in silence for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I have killed 37 people. Their families paid me to murder their loved ones, and then thanked me for my skill. The weight of this realization broke something inside Marco's mind. He left Venice that evening and never practiced medicine again. Last I heard, he had joined a monastery where he spent his remaining years in silent penance. But his visit had an unintended consequence. It spread Giovanni's crisis of conscience to other plague doctors across Europe within months. Reports arrived of plague doctors abandoning their practices after mysterious crises of faith. Alessandro di Milano stopped accepting patients and began writing obsessive letters to university authorities, demanding investigations into treatment protocols. Francesco di Bologna publicly burned his medical books and announced that he was retiring to pray for forgiveness for crimes committed in ignorance. But for every plague doctor who succumbed to doubt, 10 others rallied to defend the system that gave their lives meaning. The University of Paris issued a formal condemnation of dangerous melancholy affecting certain practitioners, attributing the crisis to excessive contemplation of mortality leading to spiritual corruption. The Church declared that questioning established medical wisdom was a form of pride that bordered on heresy. Most tellingly, the medical establishment developed new theoretical frameworks to explain away the crisis itself. Plague doctor melancholy became an official diagnosis, described as a mental condition that affected physicians who spent too much time observing death without properly understanding its spiritual significance. The recommended treatment was prayer, bloodletting, and renewed study of classical medical texts. The system had learned to pathologize doubt itself. Any plague doctor who questioned treatment protocols was, by definition, suffering from a medical condition that required correction. Their doubts weren't evidence of logical problems with the system. Their doubts were symptoms of their own illness. But the crisis had revealed something crucial. The system's power depended on the absolute faith of its practitioners. If enough plague doctors stopped believing in their own methods, the entire structure would collapse. The question was whether that would happen before or after the system spread to every population center in the known world by winter. I had become an unofficial coordinator for what we privately called the recovery. Underground, families who were secretly treating plague victims without medical intervention. The network operated through coded messages, hidden meetings, and carefully planned deceptions designed to avoid the legal and religious penalties for refusing proper medical care when a family member developed plague symptoms. The network would arrange for false reports to authorities claiming the patient had died immediately, before medical treatment could be arranged. The deceased would then be hidden and cared for using nothing but rest, water, light food, and prayer until they either recovered or died naturally. The results were consistent with my original observations, roughly 60% recovery rate, with recovered patients achieving complete immunity to further infection. But the network had to operate in absolute secrecy, because the legal penalties for abandoning plague victims to suffering included imprisonment, property confiscation, and excommunication. The state had made survival a crime. Yet the network grew, spread through whispered recommendations and desperate families who had watched too many relatives die under expert medical care. Each family that successfully saved a loved one through non-treatment became a recruiting point for others facing the same choice. By spring, the recovery underground included hundreds of families across northern Italy, all secretly collaborating to save lives by avoiding the medical system designed to help them. And we achieved something the plague doctors never had: actual recoveries. People who would have died under proper medical care were walking around healthy, immune, and grateful to be alive. Their existence was living proof that the medical establishment was systematically killing patients who could have been saved, but that proof was invisible to the larger society, because we had to keep our successes secret to avoid legal persecution. The most effective medical treatment in Europe was being practiced as a criminal conspiracy. By summer 1350, I had enough data to calculate the true impact of the plague doctor system on European mortality. The numbers were staggering. In cities with active plague doctors, 90 to 95%. Mortality rates for all plague cases, with death occurring within days of treatment initiation. In rural areas without medical access, 40 to 60% mortality rates, with deaths occurring after weeks of illness and recovery rates of 40 to 60%. The most advanced medical system in human history was killing roughly twice as many people as would have died without any medical intervention whatsoever. But the mathematical proof of this atrocity was scattered across hundreds of secret records maintained by underground networks. While the official medical literature showed only the success stories of swift, merciful death provided by expert care, the system had achieved perfect information control. Evidence of its failures was illegal to collect, dangerous to possess, and impossible to publish. Meanwhile, evidence of its success was institutionally required, professionally rewarded, and religiously sanctioned. Truth had become a crime, while systematic murder had become a virtue. And the most horrifying realization was that this inversion of reality hadn't happened through conspiracy or malice, but through the normal operation of logical systems designed to help people. The plague doctors genuinely believed they were saving humanity. The universities genuinely believed they were advancing knowledge. The church genuinely believed they were reducing suffering. The state genuinely believed they were protecting public health. Every institution involved was pursuing its highest values with complete sincerity while participating in the largest medical disaster in human history. Standing in Venice in December 1350, watching the last plague doctors pack their equipment as the epidemic finally ended, I understood that I had witnessed something that would echo through centuries. The fundamental pattern was now established. Medical systems that existed primarily to perpetuate themselves rather than heal patients. Institutional structures that made questioning their methods professionally suicidal. Legal frameworks that criminalized alternatives to approved treatments. The plague doctor system had created the template for medical authoritarianism disguised as scientific expertise, and looking forward through time, I could see the pattern repeating: medical establishments that declared their methods infallible while producing uniformly terrible results. Institutional systems that pathologized doubt and criminalized alternatives. Regulatory frameworks that protected professional interests while sacrificing patient welfare. The specific treatments would change. Bloodletting would be replaced by other interventions. Mercury would be replaced by other toxins. Aromatic purification would be replaced by other useless protocols. But the fundamental structure would remain. Systems that interpreted their failures as evidence of success. Institutions that protected themselves by silencing criticism. And legal frameworks that made effective treatment illegal while mandating harmful treatment. The plague doctors had invented the modern medical industrial complex 5 centuries before it would reach full flower, and they had done it with the sincere intention of reducing human suffering. What haunts me most, looking back across centuries, is how perfectly the plague doctor system predicted the future of institutional medicine. The same logical structures, the same defense mechanisms, the same inversion of values where protecting the system becomes more important than protecting patients. I've watched medical establishments declare treatments safe and effective while systematically suppressing evidence of harm. I've seen regulatory agencies captured by the industries they were supposed to regulate. I've observed legal systems that criminalize informed consent while mandating dangerous procedures. The faces change. The technology improves, but the fundamental pattern remains unchanged. Institutions that exist primarily to perpetuate their own authority while claiming to serve public health, and the most terrifying aspect isn't the institutional behavior itself. It's the fact that most participants genuinely believe they're helping people while participating in systematic harm, just like Giovanni believed he was providing merciful death to the incurably ill while actually murdering patients who might have recovered naturally. Plague Doctor system revealed something profound about human nature. Our capacity for self-deception is so vast that we can participate in atrocities while experiencing ourselves as heroes. And once institutional systems learn to exploit this capacity, they become nearly impossible to reform from within, because reform would require the people who benefit from the system to admit that their entire professional identity is built on causing the very harm they claim to prevent. Today, as I write these words, I see the pattern everywhere. Medical systems that mandate treatments with 100% failure rates while criminalizing approaches with significant success rates. Institutions that declare questioning their methods to be a form of dangerous extremism. Regulatory frameworks that protect corporate profits while sacrificing public health. The plague doctor's leather beak has been replaced by other symbols of authority, but the function remains identical: to provide psychological comfort to both practitioners and patients while delivering systematic harm disguised as expert care. And just like in Giovanni's time, the system maintains its power through perfect information control. Evidence of failure is professionally dangerous to collect, economically expensive to maintain, and legally risky to publish. Meanwhile, evidence of success is institutionally required, financially rewarded, and socially praised. The recovery underground still exists, operating through coded communications and hidden networks, helping people survive by avoiding the medical systems designed to help them. And the mathematical reality remains unchanged. The most effective treatments are often illegal, while the most harmful treatments are often mandatory. We haven't escaped the plague doctor system. We've simply perfected it. I'm the historian. I have seen humanity repeat this pattern across millennia. The faces change, the technology improves, but the fundamental delusion remains the same. Perhaps one day, you'll prove me wrong. Perhaps one day, we'll create medical systems that prioritize patient welfare over institutional survival, that welcome doubt instead of criminalizing it, that measure success by recovery rates instead of compliance rates. Until then, I'll keep watching, I'll keep remembering, and I'll keep telling you what I saw, because somewhere in our cities tonight, people wearing different masks are providing treatments that kill with the same sincere intention of helping that animated Giovanni della Morte in Venice 675 years ago, and their patients thank them just as gratefully for the expert care they receive on their way to preventable deaths. The costume has changed. The performance continues.